aduna bi alsama tey mënatuñu nangu ñun doomi Afrika ngeen di ñu xool ak benn bët. Wake up, good morning. This is Dakar.
This panel will be dealing with two things that have cropped up in the last hour and a half: capacity building and partnerships. The debate in that all along when talking about sustainable development goals and why we might not get there when we want to get there in 2030 is about how we sustain the capacity that we develop. But it's also about partnerships and equality in partnerships. Now we need to talk about this subject of global health and how we might do it differently and begin to offer lessons to other people. This eminent panel has a lot to offer. What is the one lesson in the area of capacity building that can help us sustain capacity? The first speaker from Ethiopia talked about this beautiful relationship that is based on projects mostly. He's talking about how we can begin to institutionalize this. It means we haven't, and this is not applicable to just one set of issues. Across the board, institutionalizing capacity building, especially when we're talking about relationships between global North and global South, is a main challenge. The second question I'll be asking different members of the panel to respond to is an idea for making these partnerships more equal. We talk about North-South partnerships. Are we assuming that the North-North partnerships are working well in helping us consolidate how we respond? But we also talk about South-South partnerships as though we all have a meeting of minds in the South. Let's talk about it and come up with some ideas. Do you have an idea, a particular lesson you want to share in terms of how we can begin to sustain capacity in a way that institutionalizes capacity development and not through one-off projects?
Thank you very much. I think this is quite a challenging question we have been trying to deal with for a while. I think capacity building has to be an internal agenda. It's not something that can be imposed from outside, as critical as it is. But that can be negotiated, I think, i.e. there could be a very important capacity building gap that the institution might not notice. And this has been our experience sometimes. And that agenda may have to be negotiated. But the interest has to come, cannot be imposed, because even if one starts for a period, it stops.
When a donor comes with an initiative, I've seen institutions that say yes, even though that's not what the priority is. How do you think the match, in terms of kind of partnership can come? How do you make it mutually beneficial without feeling that you just want to receive resources?
I think it works both ways. So we want to understand where the funder is coming from, and we try to make the best out of that. Sometimes it's not, it's in some ways it's not negotiable. So we implant something that's our own agenda. It's not easy to say no to money. I have to say that. But we always make sure our agenda is in it.
On North-North, we have UCL here, we have King's here, and maybe in the past we had been seen more as rivals, but of late we have been fantastic collaborators. What is it that we can do differently? What is it that how can we leverage the kinds of capacity we have here to build the right kinds of partnerships between ourselves or amongst institutions in the North that can help our partners in the Global South?
Thank you very much for that question. As long as King students promise not to go and steal Jeremy Bentham's head from UCL, I will be fine. Right, so it's one subject that I'm actually quite keen and passionate about, and I'm delighted that I've already had discussions with Martin Prince and with Ardazi and Peter Piot, and on the back of those discussions, we organized an event at the Creek And one of the key conclusions of that event is that we must do more together. Competition is a great thing. It gives us things like Sabin and Salk and different vaccines to eliminate polio, but sometimes competition can be counterproductive. So I would argue that there are instances where working together, including in our teaching, including in our research, where we're in the same countries, can actually mean we achieve a lot more than we can do individually. And many of the things that I discussed today, you could do the same presentation, I suspect, at Imperial, at the London School of Hygiene, or at UCL. And when we bring all of it together, we can do a lot more.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, I think that the challenges here that we're confronting are so substantial that we would be idiots if we didn't learn from each other and work together. I say that recognizing that we don't have a great history of doing that. And taking London in particular, I often observe that London has a great history of being less than the sum of its parts because we compete at the expense of collaboration. So I think we have a moral obligation to work in partnership and work together. And I've no doubt we'll be more effective for doing so. I think that there are good signs, there are green shoots, and we need to make those green shoots grow into oak trees.
Yes, I think to me one of the things that strikes me about all of our activities is that we impose such costs on the countries we work in collectively. Because any of us who work in Africa, particularly in low-resource settings, know that the very small pool of researchers can be pulled in different directions. As was said by my colleague, it's difficult to say no to money. I certainly would like to put pressure on funders to improve that situation. I think we hear an awful lot about the fragmented structure for aid. We have the Paris Agreement, the Accra Agenda for Action, that not been very effective, but at least trying to address the fragmentation of overseas development assistance. We've had very few initiatives in the area of research funding that are similar, and so I think there's inadequate recognition of the system that we're all part has very perverse consequences on the countries we work in. So I would argue that we ought to be part of trying to find solutions for that. We all work with the same limited partners. We should seek to put those partners in the driving seat, to work to support them and not to make their lives more difficult.
Can I just push you a little bit on that? I think that's really excellent. If you were talking to a donor that is funding area of global health and you have a couple in the room, you have several in the room, what would be the key thing you want them to achieve?
I think one of the key things is the importance of long-term relationships, and it's longer-term program funding and not just project funding, because I think program funding isn't the sole solution, but project funding produces more fragmented relationships than longer term. And also for capacity strengthening, longer-term funding is utterly critical.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Let me move to, I think let's have one more academic shed light on this for us. If we go to what Sussex and King's have been able to achieve together in Ethiopia, for example, what is the one lesson that...
That's an excellent question. I think I'd like to echo what's just been said about the long-term nature of these relationships. We've heard from Martin that the King's Addis Ababa University relationship is about 20 years old, and that between BSMS and Addis Ababa is over 10 years old as well. So chronicity is so important. A wise mentor from the development field once said that development was all about chains of trust, and I see most of our global health endeavours as rather the same, requiring these chains of trust which can't be built overnight. So I'd echo again, we need the funding apparatus to enable these very long-term partnerships and chains of trust to develop.
What is the one recommendation you think we should make to funders?
Well, I think that people have to realise that the majority of funders, and there are some exceptions, the Wellcome Trust possibly, the Gates Foundation is another, but most of them are actually having to work on a cycle of their own. So, for example, the kind of funding that I deal with has to work on the political cycle for the United Kingdom. We cannot make very long-term projections, and that's the nature of democracy. governments can't pre-commit subsequent governments. And the same is true for many other funders. In my view, this can be mitigated to some degree, and I'm very much in favour of this, in fact, by funders coming together. Because what then happens is you end up with people working with different cycles, which mean that actually you don't have a boom and bust that's imposed on you by the structure you've got. And I've tried to push very hard, both when I was in DFID and also in my current job, to do stuff with the Wellcome Trust of the Gates Foundation, with the research councils, because we work in these different cycles, and it gives a bit more certainty to the people who are being funded, both in the Global South and in the Global North. None of us would pretend this is an ideal situation, but this is the situation we have to work with. And I think rather than sort of claim that we can create some kind of nirvana on this, I think the key thing is to try and find pragmatic solutions that give us abilities to have relatively medium, at least to long-term funding.
Actually, it reinforces the point earlier. You cannot do capacity development by coming from outside and imposing it. We cannot treat all countries as the same. Ethiopia, India, etc., there is a critical mass within the countries to essentially look at the gift horse in the mouth and say, this is what we want, and go towards equal partnerships. There are many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, either because they are too small, they are post-conflict, or because the human capital is just too low, where it's unrealistic to think that we're going to do magic and get them to the state where they are equal partners in the short term. And for those, we have to be in there for the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you so much. UKCDS, I only just heard about you recently. Can you give us some perspective, give us your own perspective on this whole question of finding the appropriate framework and mechanism to ensure sustained capacity building in the Global South? Please.
So maybe I should start by explaining who UKCDS are and what we do. So yes. UKCDS is a membership organisation of 14 UK research funders, so the research councils, government departments and the Wellcome Trust. And so we recently, actually, just to touch on the issue around coherence of funding, the scoreboard, or the Strategic Coherence of ODA Funded Research Board, has been put together, which Chris from the Department of Health sits on and is chaired by Peter Piot. And that's really an initiative to try and bring together funders to talk about some of these issues and to raise the issues coming up from researchers around this. And in terms of capacity building models, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly, but one of the issues that's really come up is not focusing just on individual capacity strengthening, but really thinking about how to build the capacity of institutions so that you can actually retain these talented individuals. Because what happens is you fund the individual and they're great, but they see that they can't stay in their institution because maybe the research management isn't strong or the institution itself isn't strong, so they end up leaving, and generally to the institutions which they've partnered with. So really trying to move towards building capacity within institution, whether that's research management, and I know that Wellcome are doing some work around supporting research management, or building financial management within the institutions. And that can help with also in terms of longer term building the research ecosystems of the countries themselves.
Thank you. I think your point about building the capacity of institutions is so key. And across the fields that I know, this is the single most important challenge that, at least in Africa, African institutions face, that we develop stars within those institutions, we enable them, but then the institutions cannot retain them. What's your perspective in the Wellcome Trust around this? Thank you.
Thank you. So Wellcome have been thinking long and hard about how we can best support sustainable capacity development, and we've come up with a principle which we're trying to live by, which is shifting the centre of gravity from northern institutions to southern ones. And that's against a backdrop of all of our routine funding, which is openly available to anybody in low and middle income countries, as well as people in the UK. So we have a large array of schemes available to everybody. But on specific capacity strengthening, we're focusing in 3 areas to shift the centre of gravity. The first is to strengthen research ecosystems, so that includes institutional capacity strengthening. The second is to build a cadre of strong independent researchers. And the third is to drive sustainable and coordinated research and innovation money, particularly in Africa, so getting new money in. And the principle is that in all of those 3 activities, the money is actually devolved to Africa or India in our case, and they manage the programmes, they run the programmes, they have the budget for the programmes, and northern institutions are involved, but only if the southern PIs so wish it. So we are trying to, I guess, shift that centre.
Absolutely. I see the point. I see what you're trying to do. I see this with governments when they stop funding things directly from home and give greater decision-making, they devolve decision-making power to the embassies in the regions and so on. The UN has tried and tested this as well by ensuring that the centers have greater control over the decisions around resources. And there is no quick solution to that, because if you then devolve in that way, what happens to the ability of the northern institutions to be able to continue to support? Should there be a division of labor?
So, again, to stress that the devolving of the capacity building funding to Africa and Asian institutions is in addition to the money that we're already investing in the UK. So there's a huge amount of capacity building money and research funding going into UK institutions, and this is an additional pot. So, for example, the Deltas programme we've heard of already, that was a partnership between DFID and Wellcome, funded 11 programmes. It's run through the African Academy of Sciences. If it is renewed, fingers crossed, then they will decide how that money is spent completely. Absolutely. But there has been a very long process of us supporting the management and setup of that fund and the ability to manage those funds within AAS. So it is a long hand-holding and partnership, which we are not letting go of.
Thank you. Last but not least, Alison, can you reflect on any one of these two issues, capacity building and partnership development?
So certainly, and I think there's an example of North-North partnership development that I really would like to flag here. So it's been a major opportunity for us at Imperial getting ESRC funding to work with partners at King's that bring along the expertise in surgery with Andy Leather, with Nick Sevdalis, with implementation science, with Ewan Furley in organisation development, bringing in those experts to be able to work together on my interest, which is in infectious diseases, antibiotic resistance, and surgical outcomes. So that's really been fantastic. I would like to echo this issue about capacity building and recognising excellence in project management, in monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and knowledge mobilization. And I think that's something that we need to do within our own institutions as well, to recognize excellence in this, develop it, and sustain that. Because we are completely dependent on that expertise, and I think we need to do a lot more about recognizing it and valuing it, and it's going to be core to what we do.
Money, fees. Does anyone want to respond to the question of money and fees?
Two things have to be achieved. One of which is we have to achieve a situation where people who need learning and have the capacity can afford it. And we also need to make sure that the teaching institutions are paid, because they can't do this for nothing. Now, there are very many ways of doing that, which range from subsidising them and providing apparently free education, although that's not free in any ordinary sense, or not subsidising but providing many scholarships. And there are many other ways you can do it. The route you do it actually doesn't matter. The fact is you just have to do it by one of many different things, and usually it's a mixture of all of them. So I think we shouldn't get too obsessed by the actual methodology. What we should be sure of is trying to make sure we actually achieve the end points, which is to keep the institutions strong and the people able to come without a financial barrier.
Let's conclude. I would like you to offer some thoughts. I saw Martin challenging you earlier. I won't say what he said, but can you give us some concluding thoughts?
Sure, delighted. So, well, look, this is a really special moment, I think, in the history of the King's journey, which has been an extraordinary journey. And I speak here as a complete imposter, with great modesty. I'm a pupil of Andy Leather and Oliver and more recently Martin, and I've got huge admiration for everybody who's spoken. But this really was a piece of spontaneous combustion. It started from very small beginnings, and gradually it coalesced into something that I think is awesome, and I think has got huge potential. And I think that most of the features of what we want to do have been beautifully illustrated tonight, but I think it's all about partnerships. We've talked about different kinds of partnerships, but the fundamental partnership is between ourselves and our team and the countries in which we want to have some impact. And those partnerships, I have learned as I've sort of followed what's been going on, they really are equal partnerships. They're not dominant partnerships, they're not patronizing partnerships, they're equal partnerships. And that is partly because they are genuinely mutually beneficial. They need to be based on long-term relationships. They need to bring all the disciplines that we've heard about tonight to bear on these really important challenges. And then need to be really rich in evaluation. And there's something else that we've consistently failed to do in the NHS. We keep changing everything and we don't evaluate it, we never learn. So I think in these sorts of global health partnership arrangements, the evaluation is vital. So I think this is very exciting. I think it has huge potential. I'm vicariously very proud of what's happening, and I'm delighted that we've got colleagues from across London working with us tonight. And so the future is very exciting.
I think you'll agree with me that it's been a great privilege to have such an eminent panel here this evening. So I shan't keep you too long from drinks. But before then, I'd like you to please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful presentation.